yeah, so we're reading Individuation, is the easy way to say it. So right, we read the first section talking about the brick example, and he pointed out the sort of deficit of the hylomorphic schema. It's the fact that it doesn't properly account for the preparation required of the two aspects of the schema. So the matter and form each have to be prepared in such a way that they can interact with each other, and so that the form can be imposed on the matter. It's not just an abstract geometrical form and an abstract matter. So we're going to see a little bit more about that this time, and a different set of examples having to do with electronics of the 50s, I guess, or early 60s. So there's, if you scroll up in the chat, for those who weren't here, you can see a little bit of an explanation of some of the electronic concepts that will be helpful, and a couple of diagrams. But yeah, we'll just go along and try to make sense of it as we find these electronic concepts. So I'll start reading. The technical operation of form taking can therefore serve as a paradigm if we require this operation to indicate the veritable relations that it institutes. However, these relations are not established between the raw matter and the pure form, but between the prepared matter and the materialized form. The operation of form taking doesn't just suppose raw matter and form, but also energy. The materialized form is a form that can act as a limit at the topological boundary of a system. The prepared matter is one that can transmit energetic potentials, the technical manipulation of which charges it. In order to play a role in the technical operation, the pure form must become a system of points of application of the forces of reaction, while the raw matter becomes a homogeneous bearer of potential energy. Form taking is the mutual operation of the form and the matter in a system. The energetic condition is essential, and it is not contributed by the form alone. The whole system is the center of potential energy precisely because form taking is an in-depth operation within the whole mass, the operation of which is a state of energetic reciprocity of the matter relative to itself. The distribution of energy is what is determinative in form taking, and the mutual conformity of the matter and the form is relative to the possibility of the existence and characteristics of this energetic system. The matter is what bears this energy, and the form is what modulates the distribution of this very energy. At the moment of form taking, the matter-form unity is in the energetic regime. The hylomorphic schema only retains the extremes of these two half-chains elaborated by the technical operation. The schematism of the operation itself is obscured and ignored. There is a hole in hylomorphic representation that makes the true mediation disappear, i.e. the very operation that attaches the two half-chains to each other by instituting an energetic system, a state that evolves and must effectively exist for an object to appear with its haexiety. The hylomorphic schema corresponds to the knowledge of someone who remains outside the workshop, and he considers nothing but what enters and exits it. In order to know the true hylomorphic relation, it is not even enough to enter the workshop and work with the craftsman. We would have to penetrate into the mold itself in order to follow the operation of form taking on the different scales of magnitude of physical reality. Interesting. I'm looking at the PDF that I think Barun posted, which is like from the ebook version of the text. Do you have the physical text in front of you?
It's mine too. I have the physical version. I think this must have been like, if you notice some of the footnotes, they're not even complete. I think this is like a final draft version, and that there might have been final edits before. To be fair, the book also has lots of typos and stuff, so I don't know what happened, but.
Oh, yeah, that's too bad, because I haven't noticed any typos, I don't think, in the PDF. So it looks like they did another round of edits between the printing of the physical copy and the publication of the ebook, I guess, which is a little bit strange, especially like if you want to cite the book, then which version do you cite? If there are differences. Like the one you just pointed out doesn't seem to make really any difference in meaning. Like goes in and out is the same thing as enters and exits, I think. I don't think there's any real significance to that difference, but it could just be you could find places where there might be a difference of meaning, and then which one do you cite? It's kind of strange.
So are they both this are they both this newest version, or is one of the two the like older? Because there's a very new translation of this that just came out. Is that the one we're reading, and is it maybe the physical copy that somebody has is older? Or...
No, they're both the same translation from Taylor Adkins, which came out this past year, or in 2020. And it's just there are apparently these slight differences between the PDF version and the physical version, which is sort of strange.
Gotcha.
I wonder if it happened in that interim point where the book was held back and given back to the family for a while. Maybe there's a sort of moment where somebody looked at it and did copy-editing one last time.
Yeah, it did. Because there was an original publication date, and then they pushed it back again, and I think it came out in October finally. And so yeah, I guess somewhere in there they did more editing. But I guess the physical copy was already printed at that point, or something like that. Anyway, we'll have to if anyone who's using the physical copy notices some difference a difference that makes a difference, to use Bateson's term. Anything that seems significant, if it's just one little word choice difference, then maybe not important. But if it seems like it makes a difference in terms of the meaning, then it would be helpful to bring that up. So coming back to the passages that we just read, so there's an interesting point here, which I don't think he develops much in this book, or at least not as much as in the conclusion of the other book on the mode of existence of technical objects. So here he just says that the hylomorphic schema corresponds to the knowledge of someone who remains outside the workshop and considers nothing but what enters and exits it. So just someone standing outside the workshop in whatever social role they have. But in the technical objects book, oh yes, I should start streaming. I'll do that in a second. In the technical objects book, he actually sets out, he argues that the holomorphic schema corresponds to the slave owner's knowledge in particular. So in classical antiquity, of course, was a slave owning societies. Oh, he does bring that up here, right? Okay, yeah, we'll see that as we continue. But the argument is that the slave owner basically orders a bunch of clay, orders a bunch of molds for the bricks, and tells the slave to make a bunch of bricks, and then sort of magically, from their perspective, a bunch of bricks appear. So from the perspective of the slave owner, there's just the form of the brick and the clay that they bought, and the one gets applied to the other, just sort of by itself, or without any effort on their part. So that's this representation in terms of a pure form and a raw matter corresponds to that social role. Which I think is a pretty interesting argument, and seems right to me. And the question then is why the hylomorphic schema survives beyond the slave owning society, which it appears throughout medieval philosophy, and there are even Aristotelians around today that will still hold on to this hylomorphic schema, so that it's not tied in a sort of tight manner to the slave owning society, but it's able to survive beyond the slave owning society itself. So that would be an interesting problem to try to analyze or try to explain how it survives beyond that society, if that's what it's grounded in.
Well, we might be getting ahead of ourselves, but I think in that final section, in section 3 of this bit, he does talk a little bit about, we've sort of been speaking as though the whole idea is this technical paradigm provides this schema that gets extended into other things, but then he kind of flips that on itself and is like, well, so if that's how the technical operation works, then does that apply to life and living being? What would that kind of individuation looks like? But then through that whole conversation, he kind of comes back and it's like, it really, you can't really say that the technical schema, it comes first and then the living schema, the more advanced form of individuation, it comes about in our minds or whatever, but that it's actually because of what we are, because we are living beings, that we are able to sort of almost in reverse reduce or extend that analogy into technicity. That's kind of how I read it, and I thought that was really interesting. I think he says so kind of explicitly towards the end of this section. But
yeah, there's it's a sort of recurring theme throughout his thought, is that the role of the vital, or of our status as living beings in thought, so that certain intellectual operations are only possible because they're performed by living beings, and so we have to understand the status of these intellectual operations in the light of the vital individuation that makes them possible. And so this would be an instance of that. So it's because we are living beings that we can sort of apply the hylomorphic schema to certain domains. Oh, and I forgot to stream. Let me do that.
I think what was also interesting beyond that is that he kind of talks here about how even the technical operation that we speak of is sort of an extension of like, he's like the brick's hexaity is informed by its intended use as well, and what its purpose for human activities. So even that, it's sort of like we're talking about them as technical half chains, as though that itself isn't involved in living individuation. But again, I think this stuff kind of comes a bit later. I think the stuff we're seeing here is just establishing some of that stuff of like what we need to look at is the matter energy system state, rather than matter and form unity in a system state rather than one or the other.
All right. I think we can go on to the next paragraph, which is another long one. If someone else would like to read.
Grasped in itself, the operation of form-taking can be carried out in several ways, and according to modalities that are seemingly very different from one another. The veritable technicity of the operation of form-taking greatly surpasses the conventional limits that separate the fields and domains of labor. Consequently, through the study of energetic regime of form-taking, it becomes possible to approximate the molding of a brick with the function of an electronic relay. In an electronic tube like a triode, the matter, bearer of potential energy that is actually is the cloud of electrons emanating from the cathode in the cathode-anode effector generator circuit. The form is what limits this actualization of reserve potential in the generator, i.e. the electrical field created by the difference in potential in the control grid in the cathode, which is opposed to the cathode-anode field created by the generator itself. This counterfield is a limit to the actualization of potential energy, just as the walls of the mold are a limit to the actualization of potential energy of the clay mold system carried by the clay and its displacement. The difference between the two cases resides in the fact that the operation of form-taking is finite in terms for the clay, tends very slowly in several seconds towards a state of equilibrium, and then the brick is removed from the mold. The state of equilibrium is utilized in the unmolding when this state is attained. In the electronic tube, we utilize a support of energy, an electron cloud in a field, with a very slight inertia, such that the state of equilibrium, equivalence between the distribution of electrons and the gradient of electrical field, is obtained in the extremely short time relative to example of the brick, several milliseconds in a large tube, and several tenths of a millisecond in a very small tubes. Under these conditions, the potential of a control grid is utilized as a variable mold. The distribution of the support of energy in proportion to this mold is so rapid that it's carried out without an appreciable delay for the majority of applications. The variable mold then serves to differentiate in actualization of a source's potential energy. We do not stop when equilibrium is attained, but continue by modifying, i.e., the tension of the grid. The actualization is almost instantaneous and therefore is never a halt for the unmolding. Since the circuit of the support of energy is equivalent to a perpetual unmolding, a modulator is a continuous temporal mold. Here, the matter is almost uniquely the support of the potential energy. It nevertheless always conserves a definite inertia that prevents the modulator from being infinitely fast. In the case of the clay mold, on the contrary, what is technically utilized is the state of equilibrium that can be conserved by unmolding. A sufficient amount of the clay's viscosity is then accepted in order for the form to be conserved in the course of unmolding, even though this viscosity slows down the form taking. Conversely, in the modulator, the viscosity of the bearer of energy is reduced as much as possible, since we do not seek to conserve the state of equilibrium after the conditions of equilibrium have ended. It is easier to modulate the energy carried by compressed air than by pressurized water, and it is even easier to modulate the energy carried by electrons in transit than by compressed air. The mold and the modulator are the extreme cases, but the essential operation of form taking is accomplished in the same way for both. It consists in the establishment of an energetic regime, whether or not it persists. To mold is to modulate in a definitive way. To modulate is to mold in a continuously and perpetually variable way.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that, so in this, we have here a second example of form-taking operation, which is a different one than just the brick taking on form. So here it's a continuous form taking rather than a definitive form taking like the other example. So the flow of electricity is modulated. It's continuously modified by the control grid in the diode or electronic tube, and so the specificity of the hylomorphic schema in the brick example here is sort of extended. Obviously, this is not a type of example that Aristotle or someone like that would have taken up, but there's a way of applying the hylomorphic schema to this type of operation in a different way. Yeah, Aristotle does not talk about diodes, unfortunately. It's one of the big gaps in his philosophy.
They found like chemical batteries in like Greek ruins, right? Or like Cretan ruins that they probably used in electrolysis for jewelry making. It would have been feasible for Aristotle to talk about like basic electrodes.
So can I ask, does anyone, because I feel like, unless I'm wrong, this is the first time that he's starting to talk about unmolding as like another stage. So before we were talking about the two half chains and the form taking potentials of the matter and the limiting, I guess, pseudo work of the mold and all that stuff. But then this thing where he's getting to the, it tends towards a state of equilibrium, the brick is removed from the mold, and then the state of equilibrium is utilized in the unmolding when this state is attained. And then he kind of goes on to say that that isn't what happens in the diode, or I guess the triode. There's never a halt for the unmolding. Maybe I just need to get my brain around it, because I started to follow again, I think, in the following paragraphs, but it's just this example, I'm just not familiar with it. You know, the brick is a much obviously more like common sense example.
I think he did mention the unmolding part of the process before, but I would have to go and take a look for that again. But the idea is basically that in the example of the brick, the because of the viscosity of the clay, it Oh, actually, yeah. So the first instance is page 30. Okay, maybe not, but I thought he had maybe he just didn't use the word, and he talked about it in a different vocabulary. But in the case of the brick, you have a definitive form taking. So this is a form taking that persists through time after the actual application of force and the formation of this energetic system that consists of the mold and the clay in the mold. But in the case of the electrical circuit, or in the case of the tube, there's no definitive form taking in that sense. So there's just a continuous variation of the form, and it allows for or this is what constitutes modulation in the sense that Simondon wants to use that word, is that continuous variation of form without that moment of unmolding. And I think maybe a question here would be to what extent there is something like individuation in the case of the tube, because you just have this continuous variation of the modulation. So you don't have this form taking, this definitive form taking, like in the case of the brick. And so in the case of the brick, the individuation process and the form taking process coincide. Those are the same operation. But in the case of the tube, it's not clear that there is an individuation process because the form taking process doesn't result in a definitive form. It's just continuously varied.
So you're saying that with the triode example, that individuation doesn't take place, or?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I would argue that it does, though, that the two chains are required to give the individuation of the tube, the triode, its machinic kind of individuated hyacity. So the glass part, the mold, is required to be there, along with all the stuff that's inside. But I'm constituting the things that are inside the tube as the matter, and the glass as the form, where in fact it could very well be that the glass was part of the matter as well, so that there, I could be a little bit off here, but it seemed to me on my first read was that the integratedness of the glass with all the internal matter that's regulating the electrodes and the heat and all the individuation processes, that both have to be there in order for the hyacity of the tube to exist. And that's what separated it for me, or I was able to make the distinction from the brick, because you had the scaffolding and the mold kind of removed once the individuation of a particular brick was created.
Yeah, I think here we have to be careful to distinguish two different sort of forms of individuation, or two different questions about individuation. So the question here is not so much about the tube itself, the individuation of the tube as a physical object. It's the individuation of the electrical current in the tube. So the hylomorphic schema that he's describing here, in that hylomorphic schema, we have the matter is the electrical cloud, as he puts it, and the form is provided by the grid, and so the question there is, or the question that I was asking was whether that form taking operation is also an operation of individuation, and I think the answer to that question is no. But maybe other people disagree with that. So that contrasts. So if the answer is no, then that contrasts with the case of the brick, because in the brick, the form taking operation and the individuation, the production of an individual brick, those two operations coincide, and it's the same operation. So that would be, so it would be a sort of the individuation would never be completed in the case of the electrical current in the tube.
So I guess that's my question, and I know maybe when we move on, we'll see more. But I'm struggling with the idea of individuation not taking place versus not ending, because that sort of makes more sense to me. But earlier, I thought it was really helpful when I was rereading, like just before this section, back on 29 or 28, when he's talking about plasticity, it clicked for me a little bit, because he's talking about how the mold can have elasticity but not plasticity. Because it can move, it can be pushed around and whatnot, but it's not plastic in the way that the clay, the form-taking clay is. So it kind of crystallized for me as plasticity is that state of having potentials, or I think in his words, I have it in my notes here, the capacity to be in a state of internal resonance as soon as it is subjected to pressure in an enclosure. So if that's the case, then even if he's kind of extending this to, okay, the cloud of electrons, or as Angus is saying, the cathode anode field versus cathode grid field, I can follow that far. But I guess what I'm trying to understand is, in what way would the form of this matter not also be, maybe we're abusing the word now, but it seems to still, the idea of plasticity, or it having those potentials in the first place, is still there, right? So then I guess I'm wondering, maybe he answers it, what would it mean to not partake in individuation? That's the part that's strange to me.
So I think the question is, if there is this this gap, or this possibility of a difference between the form taking operation and the individuation operation. So if there is this possibility for something, in this case the electrical current, to undergo a process of form taking without undergoing a process of individuation. So that's the question that I was raising, and I think here, so you pointed to the plasticity in the last bit, but I think he's also, or I think the plasticity coincides in this case with viscosity, in the sense that the form taking in the case of the brick, in the case of the clay in the mold, it's a form taking that persists through time. After it takes time to for the form to be imposed on the matter, and then after that those couple of seconds that it takes to impose the form on the clay, then it persists afterwards. Whereas here, in the case of the electrical current, we're talking about a form taking that is effectively instantaneous. It takes milliseconds or tenths of a millisecond, and there's no persistence of that form after the initial imposition of the form. So it's the form taking is instantaneous, but it doesn't persist after the original.
If I may, I think it could be useful to bring some anticipatory glimpses from the rest of the book to bear on the discussion. So we have a chapter right after this one called Form and Energy. It is filled with these physical diagrams and all that. So it seems that understanding that chapter seems to require understanding contemporary physics, at least Simondon's time. And there, it really is not so much about a form that we can associate with a substance, but it really becomes more and more attenuated, his idea of individuation, so that it is no longer about asking about a resultant form or a resultant individuated product. And it no longer comes down to recognizing one. And he says on page 70, individuation as an operation is not linked to the identity of a matter, but to a state modification. So I take this to be a gesture in that direction of attenuation. So it is in this passage then, using the cathode tube as an example of individuation, I think it is more like an invitation or provocation to change or expand our idea of what individuation can be. This side or a different side to the form and matter hydromorphic schema.
Yeah, that's helpful. I hadn't thought of that connection. So yeah, it could be that it's not so much that there isn't individuation in this case. It's that the form or the type of individuation is a different kind of individuation than in the case of the brick, and the example would serve to sort of break down our initial tendency to identify individuation with something like the brick example.
So my understanding, a lot of this, I think, is coming from the book on technical objects. So I take the question to be, it seems like individuation is kind of attenuated, or it's not really full and complete. And it seems to me like that's actually pretty sort of in tune with Simondon's overall view. Because I remember him saying pretty clearly that, no matter no matter how far individuation comes, like the field of potentiality is never really exhausted. And it even seems like an individual at one level can actually be the potential for like a further individuation. And so it seems like it's just a continuous process. And I guess my reading is like individuation is always a kind of derivative feature. Like it's not primary. It's always this result, and it's always kind of in process. And I guess that maybe is one difference from Aristotle. I wonder if in the Aristotelian view, there is something like a final individual, like the fully complete, fully determined, the thing that doesn't need to sort of go any further. And I'm not sure, I don't think Simondon really has that end point.
Yeah, that's that helps to tie it back in with the more general thesis about the process of individuation and the remaining of the pre-individual, the way that the pre-individual is never exhausted in the process of individuation. Yeah, so that makes sense. And then, as we'll see in the future chapter on vital individuation, and I think he mentioned this sort of in passing in the introduction as well, the difference between physical individuation and vital individuation is going to be explained in terms of the temporality of the process of individuation. So that in the case of vital individuation, the individuation process persists throughout the life of the individual. So a living being is constantly in the process of individuation, as opposed to as opposed to a physical individual, which is individuated once and then can only degrade as an individual. So the case of the electrical current would actually be a little bit closer to the case of the living individual, because it's sort of constantly undergoing individuation.
Yeah, I suspect you're right about that, because the circuit analogy, it's like as though we're getting closer to more and more complex ways of discussing it that will be able to be extended into living being. But I do think that was helpful, Ruins, because otherwise I think I would have not understood what we were reading if no individuation was taking place.
So I think we can go on to the next two sort of moderate length paragraphs. Someone else would like to read?
I don't mind reading. Where are we? Sorry, let me pull this up.
We're at many technical operations.
Cool. Many technical operations utilize a form taking that has intermediate characteristics between molding and modulation. Thus, a spinneret and a rolling mill are molds with a continuous regime that create a definitive profile in successive stages, called passes. Unmolding is continuous in this case, just like in a modulator. We could conceive a rolling mill that would really modulate matter and fabricate, for example, a crenellated or indented ingot. Rolling mills that produce striated sheet metal modulate matter, whereas a smooth rolling mill merely models it. Molding and modulation are the two extreme cases of which modeling is the intermediate case. We would like to show that the technological paradigm is not without value, and that to a certain extent it allows us to think the genesis of the individuated being, but only on the express condition that we retain as an essential schema the relation of matter and form through the energetic system of form-taking. Matter and form must be grasped during form-taking, at the moment when the unity of the becoming of an energetic system constitutes this relation on the level of the homogeneity of forces between matter and form. What is central and essential is the energetic operation, which supposes energetic potentiality and a limit of actualization. The initiative of the genesis of substance neither boils down to matter as passive nor to form as pure. What generates is the complete system, and it generates because it is a system of the actualization of potential energy that combines in an active mediation two realities of two different orders of magnitude within an intermediate order.
So we have introduced here a third term. So we have molding as one extreme, in the case where the form taking is definitive or permanent, and then we have modulation in the other extreme case is where the form taking is only instantaneous, and there's a continuous variation of form. And then modeling is the intermediate case between those two. So it would be something like a form taking that is varied over time, but is not doesn't disappear instantaneously, like in the case of the electrical current. So I think the rolling mill example would be something like forming a metal object of some kind, and making the metal take on form in this way. But there's a variation in terms of the right. Yeah. So Angus has given a couple of examples or a couple of clarifications in the chat there, but in terms of the form taking operation is not instantaneous, as in the case of the electrical current, and it persists through time, like in the case of the molding. But it's also not. But it also involves a variation through the process. So there's a constant variation of the molds in order to impose the form. But it's form taking that persists after that initial variation.
Is the example of like the sword kind of craft is that too extreme in one direction? I was just thinking of another situation where you're there's a series of intermediate form takings, or is that kind of not what he's getting at?
I mean, again, I'm not like very well versed in metallurgy or anything like that, but my understanding is that the sword forging example would be something more like the molding, where you would pour the liquid metal into the mold, and then it would solidify, taking on a form. But yeah, if you have to, the sort of blacksmith operation of using a hammer to bang on the metal to make it into whatever form you need to take on. I think that would be maybe closer to the modeling case. But yeah, I guess the example is, yeah, the point here is that the form taking operation can either be an instantaneous operation over the whole system, like in the case of the brick, or not instantaneous, but a rapid operation over the course of the whole mass of matter. Whereas in the case of the rolling mill, it's you sort of feed the matter into the form gradually the form taking is proceeding through time, but then it persists after that form taking has happened. So the difference between as he says, the difference between a rolling mill that produces striated sheet metal versus a smooth rolling mill. So in the one case, you have a variation of the form through time, which is imposed on the matter. And in the other case, you have the same form, but it's imposed on the matter through time as you feed the matter through the form. So in the case of the smooth rolling mill, it's just a case of modeling, because the form doesn't vary through time.
So I've got a question. I guess it's a little bit more general. I'm thinking about the whole dialectic with the Aristotelian model, and sort of I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly what's at stake, and what Simondon is driving at when he's arguing against hylomorphism. And the thing I want to do, though, is I also want to say something kind of in fairness to Aristotle, because I guess I have a bit of a worry about maybe there being a bit of a straw man going on. And so the thing that really comes to mind is, Aristotle definitely talks about form and matter. The point, though, is those are only two of the four causes, right? And the full, like, Aristotelian view of causality involves, in addition to form and matter, also an efficient and a final cause, right? And my sense is, I mean, I'm not Aristotle expert, but my sense is that the full model can actually accommodate processes. So in addition to having like a mold as the form and like a sort of stuff as the matter, we also have like an agent, and also like a purpose. And I think on the full sort of Aristotelian account, you can even accommodate something like a milieu. I think something like an environment. And so, Heidegger's reading of the four causes, for example, he kind of gives a reading like that, sort of a phenomenological reading. And I guess that makes me wonder exactly what's at stake in this, the beef with Aristotle. Like, if we actually take like the larger account, it seems to me like some of this processual sort of process-oriented stuff that Simondon is talking about in his examples may be accommodated within the larger hylomorphic model. If you bring in something like a final cause and something like an agent or a worker, or and you could probably introduce stages as well, like sort of different sort of stages of structuration with maybe gradations of form. And so, but it seems to me that may not solve the issue. And it seems to me Simondon might go further and say, well, but even the full Aristotle account is not enough. There's still something more basic that he is after. So anyway, that's just kind of my general. I don't know if it can be answered right here and right now, but it's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Well, there's a couple of good points in there. But first, I think I would want to distinguish between the doctrine of causality, or the theory of causality, and the theory of individuation. Because as you pointed out, Aristotle has this four causes model of causation. So there's the formal, material, efficient, and final causes in the medieval terminology. But the three, so the formal, efficient, and final causes, they all, in a sense, they all sort of point towards the formal, in the sense that the end of a process of development is the form of that entity. So the chestnut that grows into an oak tree, it has it's the form of the oak tree that governs the process of development of that chestnut into the tree. And so the model of individuation in Aristotle is just the form and matter. It's so in the case of living beings, for example, it's the soul is the form, and the matter is the body. That's a sort of a oversimplified account of it, or oversimplified presentation. But the depiction of individuation of an entity is in terms of form and matter. It's a two-part account, or a two-element account, whereas the account of causation is a four-element account. But I think the bigger question of what is at stake in the opposition with Aristotle is a good one, because I mean, at one level it's just an intellectual problem. It's a question of trying to have adequate concepts to grasp individuation. But the question is, like, why do we care about having an adequate concept of individuation? And I think maybe the book on technical objects has a more of a practical answer to why we would care about having a correct concept of individuation, because in that book it has to do with the way that the individuation of a technical object sort of governs the way that it's incorporated into culture. Is one aspect of one more practical aspect of why we would care about individuation. But it's I think a bigger question that is worth sort of keeping in mind as we continue reading the book.
One of the problems, I mean, I suppose we should continue, but the first thing that comes to mind is that what we risk by sort of introducing more and more stages and individuals is that you get stuck in this kind of, it's like the Zeno's paradox thing that Bergson is obsessed with, of like, you can kind of endlessly introduce further individuals and further kind of like juxtaposed states to explain other states, but merely juxtaposing them on their own doesn't itself explain the movement, or I guess in Simondon's language, the phase shifting from one phase to another. And I guess I'm still wrapping my head around this, but my initial thought would be that coming from that kind of like Bergsonian angle, like I said in the chat, that there's something about qualitative multiplicity that can't simply be enumerated by quantitative multiplicities and just kind of adding more and more enumerations to explain how a qualitative multiplicity comes about. And at least from that thinker's angle, there's this way in which qualitative multiplicity almost is the conditioning factor for quantitative multiplicities rather than the reverse. And so I'm just thinking about his early statements in the beginning of the book about transduction and how the point of transduction and what he's doing, I suppose, is to confer, I think he says, confer being, the status of being, onto operations which we would normally consider strictly logical, because there's something about the movement of knowledge sort of like entering. I'm trying to look at my notes here. I think he says extracting the resolving structure from the very tensions of the domain, which is different from deduction. There's like an intuitive way that it has to be approached that can't strictly be done through, I guess, traditional analogy. And I guess he'll explain more about what he means by things like allegmatics and stuff like that. But I guess that's kind of my initial thought of like juxtaposing states in and of itself might not be enough for him, at least. Maybe your objection is a good one, but I'm thinking for Simondon, I think there needs to be more than just more actors in the process or more states, because you still have to get from one state to another, which is I think one of the problems with the hylomorphic schema. It's like, okay, you can have form, you can have matter, you can have all these things, but there's this kind of miraculating magical moment that isn't really explained when the combination happens. And if you, rather than seeing them both as pure and that, they just have pure characteristics that just combine into a new thing, but there's kind of latent potentials. And I think at one point, and he says that it's as though the form operates on the form taking in the matter. So it's not even just form on matter. It's like form on form in a sense. Anyway, I'm rambling, but that's kind of my initial thoughts.
One thing might be worth bringing in, just on the Aristotle question, on the Aristotle side. So in this issue of the formal and final causes, I wonder how that's going to turn out, because it seems like when he gets to the metaphysics, the final cause starts to play a role. Like the individuation, it seems to me, in Aristotle has to do with final causality in some way. And so that's making me, so this kind of idea of there is a kind of perfect prime mover, and the prime mover is that's being qua being, in a sense, and all things strive to imitate that. And it seems like that kind of teleological picture is really kind of, I mean, in my reading at least, is sort of the heart of the Aristotelian view. And it seems like that is what's being, that is very problematic for Simondon. That, individuation doesn't happen through teleology. It happens through a kind of immanent, self-moving process. Doesn't have the transcendence of a prime mover or anything like that. And I wonder if philosophically, like on a broader sort of sweep, maybe that's the, almost like a kind of, I mean, Simondon is not exactly a mechanistic thinker, but there is something of that, like something of like antecedent causation rather than a final causation is privilege, maybe.
Yeah, I think one way of setting out that opposition would be that in Aristotle, as he explains, the actual is first, is prior to the potential. So in the sense, well, in a number of senses, but in one sense is that the what he calls God, or the in a number of very obscure texts, it's what everything is sort of oriented towards, that actuality, that pure actuality is prior, is ontologically prior to entities like ourselves that have potentiality and actuality in this sort of mixed state. And whereas for Simondon, the potential, I think, is ontologically prior. So the pre-individual is in a state of potentiality, and it's ontologically prior to the actual that results from the process of individuation. Yeah, I think it would be an interesting paper to try to set out exactly what the opposition between Simondon and Aristotle is, to explain it in as clearly as possible, because Simondon doesn't sort of refer to specific texts of Aristotle here. He just sort of takes the hylomorphic schema in general. So you would have to do some work to apply this or to try to see how well it applies to Aristotle's particular texts. And maybe they would also be useful to look at the complementary texts to this book on the history of the notion of individuation. On the history of the notion of the individual. Because there is more discussion of Aristotle in there, and his notion of individuation. That's in volume 2 of the translation. Would someone like to read the last paragraph of this section?
I can read that if I'm not talking over somebody else I muted.
No, I don't think so. I don't hear anyone.
Okay. Hold on, sorry. Switching to voice activity. So it's in the classical sense of the term, that paragraph?
Yes, that's the one.
Okay. In the classical sense of the term, individuation cannot have its principle in matter or in form. Neither form nor matter are enough for form-taking. The veritable principle of individuation is genesis itself in the course of being carried out, i.e. the system in the course of becoming while energy is actualized. The veritable principle of individuation cannot be sought in what exists before individuation occurs or in what remains after individuation is completed. What is individuating is the energetic system, to the extent that it realizes within it this internal resonance of the matter about to take form and a mediation between orders of magnitude. The principle of individuation is the singular manner in which the internal resonance of this matter about to take this form is established. What makes it such that a being is itself different from all others is neither its matter nor its form, but the operation through which its matter has taken form in a certain system of internal resonance. The principle of individuation of the brick is neither the clay nor the mold. Other bricks than this will emerge from this pile of clay and this mold, and they will each have their own hexeity. But the principle of individuation is this operation through which the clay at a given moment in an energetic system that consisted of the smallest details of the mold, as well as the smallest pilings of this humid earth, has taken form under a certain pressure, distributed in a certain way, diffused in a certain way, and actualized in a certain way. There has been a moment when the energy of the pressure has been transmitted in all directions, from each molecule to all the others, from the clay to the walls and from the walls to the clay. The principle of individuation is the operation that realizes an energetic exchange between the form and the matter up to the point that the ensemble ends in a state of equilibrium. It could be said that the principle of individuation is the allegmatic operation common to matter and form through the actualization of potential energy. This energy is the energy of a system. It can produce effects in all the points of the system equally. It can produce effects in all the points of the system equally, is available, and can be communicated. This operation depends on the singularity or singularities of the concrete here and now. It envelops them and amplifies them.
Just before we get into the discussion of this, there's a missing sentence in the translation, at least in the PDF version. Maybe it's present in the book, but where is it? Right, so there's the sentence, the principle of individuation is the singular manner in which the internal resonance of this matter about to take this form is established. And then right after that, in the French, it says, the principle of individuation is an operation. And then it goes on to say what makes it such that a being is itself, etc. So there's a missing sentence there. But I don't think it sort of changes the meaning that much, but it's helpful to have that explicitly stated that the principle of individuation is an operation. Oh, it is there in the printed book. Interesting. So yeah, when they did the editing, they somehow deleted the sentence, I guess. So there are some cases where the PDF is better, and there are other cases where the printed book is better, which is kind of annoying. Yeah, this term allegmatic is just sort of thrown in, but it's not defined anywhere. And there is one of the complementary texts in Volume 2 is called Allegmatics, or the Allegmatic or something like that. And I think I don't want to set us on the wrong path, but I think allegmatics or the allegmatic is basically synonymous with the transductive. So an allegmatic operation is an operation of form taking in a potential field. So a pre-individual field containing potential energy undergoes this sequential process of form taking. And I think that's what he has in mind when he talks about allegmatic. So the principle of individuation is an allegmatic operation common to matter and form. So it's this operation that proceeds through time of form taking.
This footnote seems important. That last sentence, that the operation depends on the singularity or singularities of the concrete here and now. It envelops them and amplifies them. And then the footnote says, these real singularities, which are the occasion of a shared operation, can be called information. Form is a device, dispositif, for producing them. I'm not sure I have an answer about that, but it's just earlier in the text when I was rereading, I realized that, I'll try and pull out the quotes, but he refers to the mold as the singularity in the brick case multiple times. And so it's an interesting, and then he also distinguishes between, I think at one point he says that even in the unmolding process, there can be other kinds of singularities which affect the final unmolding that are like pebbles and rocks and like things like that. But the point is there's something recasting the mold as something that is not beyond just the fact that it's a limiting force and all this stuff, but that it's that the singularity itself is called information, meaning, in the sense of formation, that it's topological as well as what is he? I think he says noetic is the word. So the what it does isn't just known in terms of abstract forces, I suppose, but in terms of how it is actually topologically part of the shaping process of the thing in formation. It's all quite a lot, but I just thought it's such a little footnote, but it seems like he's setting something up there.
Yeah, I think partly what he wants to do with that in that footnote, or what he's doing with that footnote, is relativizing this idea of form, so that we don't think of the form-taking operation as this imposition of a pre-existent abstract form onto a pre-existent raw matter, but instead we think of the form-taking as a process or an operation which happens through time, and so the singularity that is the occasion, as he puts it, the occasion of this operation doesn't need to take the shape of something like a form, a global form of the whole entity. It can also be like in the crystallization example, just the germ which brings about the crystallization of the whole supersaturated solution. And in the case of the brick, you can have these parasitic singularities, I think is the term he uses, of like little, like gravel mixed in with the clay or something like that, that causes the brick to form in a different way, and the little irregularities of the mold and so on. So that we have to look at the information, I guess singularities that bring about the form taking operation in a certain manner, rather than looking at form as a sort of global essence of the entity that sort of is imposed onto the matter.
I found some of the other footnotes, and I think maybe, again, we don't have to dwell on this, but just to help clarify it for maybe for anyone listening, we found there's a footnote 5 that Angus and I were just looking at, where he calls the mold the mediating singularity. But then later on, I think actually in this next section, he calls here and now singularities like pebbles, irregularities, the wear and tear of the mold. So then if you go back to footnote 7, and he says these real singularities, which are the occasion of a shared operation, can be called information. It's as though there's a way of looking at those features as though they're not, descriptive things that just are part of the final individual, but were themselves all part of the, the form-taking process. I'll still be teasing this out, but I just thought it would be helpful to define those different things.
Okay, I think we can go on to the next section, or subsection, whatever you want to call it. We probably won't finish the whole thing today, but it is fairly short. We'll see how far we get, and then we'll continue from there next time. So I'll read the next bit. Let me just scroll down. Okay, so subsection 3, limits of the hylomorphic schema. Nevertheless, the technological paradigm cannot be extended in a purely analogical way to the genesis of all beings. The technical operation is completed in a limited time. After actualization, it leaves behind a partially individuated, more or less stable being that inherits its haecceity from this operation of individuation that has constituted its genesis in a very short time. At the end of several years or several thousand years, the brick turns back into dust. The individuation is completed in a single stroke. The individuated being is never more perfectly individuated than when it leaves the hands of the craftsman. Thus, there is a certain exteriority of the operation of individuation relative to its result. Conversely, in the living being, the individuation is not produced by a single operation that is limited in time. The living being is itself partially its own principle of individuation. It constitutes its individuation, and instead of merely being a result that progressively degrades, the result of an initial operation of individuation becomes the principle of a further individuation. The individuating operation and the individuated being are not in the same relation within the product of the technical effort. Instead of a becoming after individuation, the becoming of the living being is always a becoming between two individuations. The individuating and the individuated are in a prolonged allegmatic relation in the living being. In the technical object, this allegmatic relation only exists for a moment when the two half chains are connected to one another, i.e. when the matter takes form. In this moment, the individuated and the individuating coincide. When this operation is finished, they become separate. The brick does not bring its mold along with it, and it becomes detached from the worker or the machine that has pressed it. After being initiated, the living being continues individuating itself. It is simultaneously the individuating system and the partial result of individuation. A new regime of internal resonance is established in the living being, the paradigm of which technology does not provide. A resonance through time created by the recurrence of the result going back towards the principle and becoming principle in turn. Just like in the technical individuation, an ongoing internal resonance constitutes the organismic unit. But in addition, a resonance of the successive, a temporal allegmatics is superimposed onto this resonance of the simultaneous. The living being's principle of individuation is always an operation, just like form taking, but this operation has two dimensions, that of simultaneity and that of succession through ontogenesis maintained by memory and instinct. So here I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but he brings up this distinction between physical and vital individuation with respect to their temporal structure. So the physical individuation is an individuation that is completed in a moment or a short span of time, and then the resulting individual can only degrade after that. So the brick after a certain period of time just turns back into dust. And in the case of the living individual, he puts it in the introduction. He says that there is something like a physical individuation of the vital individual, of the living being, but there's also at the same time there's this second layer of individuation, or this second sort of temporal structure of individuation. That means that the living individual, the living being, is individuating itself through time rather than being just the result of a process of individuation that has already occurred. So I think this is what these two dimensions that he mentions at the end of that paragraph. I think that's what that means. So there's this dimension of simultaneity, which is the initial individuation. So it corresponds to the physical individuation of a living being, and then there's this successive dimension. So this is the individuation that persists, that is continuing through time, in the way that a living being continues to individuate itself.
I have 2 points of that I want to make that are also sort of questions. One is earlier in the paragraph. I think Simondon says that he's pretty concrete around the idea that none of the mold, the form taking of the mold remains with the brick. However, I'm not sure if that's entirely true, because oftentimes there is, in fact, a material, even a kind of scoring that could remain on the surface of the matter that takes form. And in a more abstract sense, that I think may also be in line with Simondon, is that there could be a trace that persists that may not necessarily be visible from, and this again gets into a more of a metaphysic, but postulating the idea of a trace from the form that persists on the matter that takes. So a topological trace, even though it may not necessarily be visible, is part of the individuation process, which it seems he may have disagreed with when he stated that yes, the brick does not bring its mold along with it, and it becomes detached from the worker or the machine that has pressed it. So that's one point I wanted to make. And then, what's the other one? Oh yes, and the other one has to do with, I can't quite find the right conceptual term that describes it, but somebody had mentioned recursion. 61 had mentioned that, and as the visual process ensues with trying to understand what Simondon is laying out, it seems that the recombinance of the individuation at some point does have to discard a certain amount of what came before it. So there's a kind of deletion of a certain amount of past information as it continues to individuate. So there's the second point there that came to the surface for me, and in conjunction with the first one, they're actually not. There's actually a disjunction between those 2 points. So a conflict there, because on the one hand, you might have a trace topologically on the form, and on the other hand, in the individuation process of the matter, my question is he saying or alluding to the fact that there may be that amount of individuation which discards what came before? Because he doesn't seem to be necessarily amplifying the idea that there is a trace that goes back to an initial form, that at some point the individuation does introduce a certain amount of creative novelty that doesn't have traces of the past.
Yeah, so I think in reference to the first point, I think we need to distinguish. So he says that the individual doesn't, so the brick doesn't carry its mold along with it. For example, the physical individual doesn't bring along its form with it. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't bear any sort of results of that individuation process. So as he points out in the footnote, the physical individual it carries the singularities. It manifests the singularities of the here and now that constitute the conditions of the information of its particular molding. So the particularities of the mold or of the more generally of the form that brought about the physical individuation, those particularities are reflected in the individual that persists after that moment of individuation. But it's the physical individual that results from the process is independent of that mold. So the mold you can go on to use that mold again to form a new individual. It's not tied to the one brick that it forms. So that's what it means to say that it doesn't carry its form, doesn't carry its mold with it. So in the case of physical individuation, the process of form taking results in the formation of an entity, an individuated being that is independent of the form that brought it about, but it can still bear the traces of that form-taking operation and the singularity of that form.
And as I look over some of the comments, I'm reminded too of the second point I was making does remind me of the differences that may individuate as the repetitions occur.
Yeah, I would just say that here he's only sort of giving a preview of vital individuation. We're going to see much more detail when we get to the chapter on vital individuation. So yeah, I don't want to sort of skip ahead too much, but vital individuation is also going to be a sort of relative form of individuation, because different entities, different living beings have different degrees of individuation. So he's going to talk about, for example, sponges that live in a colony state where many individuals have a shared circulatory system, or many sort of quasi-individuals share a circulatory system, and so they're not individuated in the same sense that a fish or a bird or a mammal or whatever is. So there are degrees of individuation in the case of vital individuation, but we'll see that in more detail when we get to it. Okay, so let's read the next one short paragraph and one medium paragraph. If someone else would like to read.
It can then be asked if the veritable principle of individuation is not better indicated by the living being than by the technical operation, and if the technical operation could be known as individuating, without the implicit paradigm of life that exists in us, since we are the ones who know the technical operation and practice it with our bodily schema, our habits, and our memory. This question has a large philosophical scope, since it leads us to ask if a true individuation can exist outside life. In order to know it, what should be studied is not the technical, anthropomorphic, and consequently zoomorphic operation, but the process of the natural formation of the elementary units that nature presents outside the realm defined as living. Um, shall I go on to the next one?
Yeah, let's continue from there. The sort of medium length paragraph.
Mhm. Thus, the hylomorphic schema outside technology is insufficient in its commonplace types because it ignores the very center of the technical operation of form taking and leads in this sense to ignoring the role played by the energetic conditions in form taking. Furthermore, even if it is re-established and completed as a matter-form energy triad, the hylomorphic schema runs the risk of improperly objectifying a contribution of the living in the technical operation. The intention of the fabricator is what constitutes the system, due to which energetic exchange is established between matter and energy in form taking. This system is not part of the individuated object. However, the individuated object is thought by the human being as having an individuality as a fabricated object relative to the fabrication. The hexaity of this brick as a brick is not an absolute hexaity, and is not the hexaity of this pre-existing object, because it is a brick. It is the hexaity of the object as a brick. It brings with it a reference to the intention of its usage, and through it, a reference to the fabricating intention, and therefore to the human activity that has constituted the two half chains joined into a system for the operation of form taking. In this sense, the hylomorphic schema is perhaps only seemingly technological. It is the reflection of vital processes in an abstractly known operation that derives its consistency from what is made by a living being for other living beings. This is how the great paradigmatic capacity of the hylomorphic schema is explained. Coming from life, it returns to life and is applied to life. But it has a deficiency that stems from the fact that the apprehension of consciousness that made it explicit has grasped it through the improperly simplified case of technical form taking. It grasps types more so than individuals, and examples of a model more so than realities. The matter-form duality, which grasps merely the extreme terms of what is larger and smaller than the individual, leaves in obscurity the reality that is of the same order of magnitude as the produced individual, and without which the extreme terms would remain separate, i.e., an alagmatic operation that is deployed on the basis of a singularity.
Yeah, there are a couple of translation points that I think are worth mentioning. Let me find the first one again. Right. So in the sentence, in the translation, it says the hexaity of the brick as a brick is not an absolute hexaity and is not the hexaity of this pre-existing object because it is a brick. I think it would be better to say the hexaity of this brick as brick is not an absolute hexaity. It is not the hexaity of this object pre-existing the fact that it is a brick, or pre-existing to the fact that it is a brick, something like that. Yeah, so it's not because it is a brick. There's no because there. I don't know how much that changes the sort of overall meaning of the passage, but I think that's a better translation. And then the second one is later in the paragraph where he uses the phrase "the apprehension of consciousness." He says, "This is how the great paradigmatic capacity of the hylomorphic schema is explained. Coming from life, it returns to life and is applied to life, but it has a deficiency that stems from the fact that the apprehension of consciousness that made it explicit has grasped it through the improperly simplified case of technical form taking." So apprehension of consciousness there, I would just say the becoming aware, or the becoming conscious of something. I think that's a better translation in that case as well.
Quick question about the statement in the last the last statement in the first paragraph that Ruins read starts out with the question, has a large philosophical scope, and goes into, at the end there, he says, but the process of the natural formation of the element units that nature presents outside the realm defined as living. Let me read that last statement that he makes there. What do you think he is referring to as the natural formations? I know that might beg the question because he may have gone into it in the next paragraph, but I think subtly he may be referring to the social factors that he's referring to as natural formations or formation process. But do you think that, can you elaborate a little bit on what he may have meant by the natural formations?
I think it's what we're going to see in the next, I think it's the next chapter there's another section, but then the next chapter on subatomic particles, basically, or on the physical realm, not relative to the form-taking operation and this technical schema, but understood in itself, looking at the physical realm separate from the living being. So he's going to analyze what individuation means in the case of subatomic particles. We'll get to that as we get to the next chapter.
Shall we keep reading in the interest of time?
I don't really have much to say on that paragraph. I think that paragraph is pretty clear. We can go on to the next. If someone else wants to read the next paragraph.
Nevertheless, it is not enough to critique the hylomorphic schema and to reproduce a more exact relation in the unfolding of technical form-taking in order to discover the veritable principle of individuation. It is also not enough to suppose the knowledge gained from the technical operation primarily biological paradigm. Even if the matter-form relation in technical form-taking is easily, adequately, or inadequately known due to the fact that we are living beings, a reference to the technical domain still remains necessary for us to clarify, specify, and objectify this implicit notion that the subject brings with him. If an experience of the vital is the condition for a representation of the technical, the representation of the technical in turn becomes one of the conditions for the knowledge of the vital. Thus we are sent back from one order to the other, such that the hylomorphic schema seems to owe its own universality mainly to the fact that it establishes a certain reciprocity between the vital domain and the technical domain. This schema is also not the only example of a similar correlation. Automatism, in its various forms, has been used with more or less success in order to penetrate the functions of the living being by means of representations that originate with technology, from Descartes to contemporary cybernetics. Nevertheless, an important difficulty emerges in the utilization of the hylomorphic schema. It does not indicate what is the principle of individuation of the living being, precisely because it grants to the two terms an existence prior to the relation that joins them, or at the very least because it cannot allow us to think this relation clearly. It can only represent the mixture or the piecemeal combination. The manner in which the form informs the matter is not sufficiently specified by the hylomorphic schema. To utilize the hylomorphic schema is to suppose that the principle of individuation is in the form or even in the matter, but not in the relation of the two. The dualism of substances, soul and body, is rooted in the hylomorphic schema, and we should consider whether this dualism has indeed originated with the technical sphere.
Right, so there's this reciprocity of the vital and the technical, so that it's only because we have this vital individuation that we can apply the technical schema to other spheres, but then the vital itself is something that can only be known through this technical schema. So that there's a sort of back and forth movement. And he points out that this is characteristic not just of the hylomorphic schema, but of other schemas as well, like automatism, which a technical notion that is applied to the living being, and then so it's only because we are living beings that we can use this notion of automatism to think about living beings. But then we can only understand the living being by applying this notion of automatism as well. So in each case, there's this back and forth between this technical schema, or the schema drawn from the technical sphere, and the living being, or the individuation, vital individuation, that they each one is necessary to the other, or each one presupposes the other.
I have an opinion on this rather than any deep thought, but I think the first form of reading is more interesting than automatism. What I mean is basing thought on living. It seems to me a more promising direction, because intellectualism of the kind, whether it's informational, cybernetician, transhumanist, and whatever, it seems to be it seems to have a greater likelihood of becoming something like a what's it, doxa today. And so I guess returning things to biology, returning abstract functions to biology is more promising. And he shares this with Kangian, and he's one of the great works in English, collecting his writings, is called Knowledge of Life. And that starts exactly with this kind of opening, in which knowledge of life is conditioned on life. And here it goes for Simondon's understanding of allomorphic schema.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I'm not very familiar with Kangian, but yeah, I think for Simondon, he always wants to understand cybernetics, or like a mechanistic approach to life, as sort of relativized to the living being, or maybe a better way of putting it would be that it's only ever a partial knowledge of the living being, so that you can give a mechanistic account of various vital functions, but there's something missing from the sort of the bigger picture is missing, and that's precisely vital individuation is what is missing from that picture, and so yeah, so there's this back and forth between the vital and the technical in terms of our knowledge, but it's the vital is ultimately what's more fundamental than the technical.
Can I ask then, in that sense, and this might have been answered in another text, does Simondon does he believe there is any prior state which would have preceded like the existence of that technicity, or is that kind of a fallacy for him? Like if I'm just thinking about the evolution of living beings and humanity and tools and whatnot, like is it crude to associate that technical schema simply with tools, or would there have been a point in his cosmology or whatever you want to call it, that the vital schema would have sort of come first, or is that what you're already saying? Sorry.
Yeah, there's I guess two different notions of priority. So in the one notion, or the one sense of priority, is that the vital is ontologically prior to the technical, so it's more fundamental, and we can understand the vital, or we can only understand the technical in terms of the vital. So that would be the one notion. But the second one would be a chronological priority. And there does seem to be some sense in which the vital is chronologically prior to the technical for Simondon, because in the technical objects book, in the third part of the book, he gives this genetic anthropology, so this account of the different modes of existence of a human being, or being in the world of a human being. And the first one is what he calls this primitive magical unity, which precedes the technical mode of existence. So this primitive magical unity is, I think, something we can understand in terms of a vital, or the level of the vital prior to the technical. So well, not to get into too much detail about the philosophical anthropology presented in that book, but the primitive magical unity is structured by key points and in space and time that form a network structure, and it's so it's in relation to these key points in space and time that the magical mode of existence is constituted, which seems to me to fit better with the or to correspond with the vital, the level of the vital as prior to technical individuation, right? And so the vital individuation, individuation always exceeds any sort of mechanistic knowledge. So we can have knowledge of various processes that are part of what it is to be a living being, whether it's DNA replication or whatever. You can have a mechanistic account of those processes, but the individuation of a living being is not something that you can account for in those mechanistic terms for Simondon. So there's always something that exceeds any mechanical or mechanistic approach. Yeah, let's see if we can finish the section. We just have one long paragraph and then one short one, and so we have a couple minutes left. So let's see. I guess I'll read. If I started, I'll finish it off. Where are we? Yes. In order to delve deeper into this examination, we need to consider all the conditions that surround a notional awareness. If there were nothing but the living individual being and the technical operation, then the hylomorphic schema perhaps could not be constituted. In fact, it indeed seems that the middle term between the living domain and the technical domain at the origin of the hylomorphic schema was social life. What the hylomorphic schema primarily reflects is a socialized representation of labor and an equally socialized representation of the individual living being. The coincidence between these two representations is the mutual foundation of the extension of the schema from one domain to the other, and the guarantee of its validity in a determined culture. The technical operation that imposes a form on a passive and undetermined matter isn't just an operation considered abstractly by the spectator who sees what enters the workshop and what leaves it without knowing the elaboration properly speaking. This is essentially the operation controlled by the free man and executed by the slave. The free man chooses the matter, which is undetermined because it suffices to designate it generically by the name substance, without seeing it, without manipulating it, and without preparing it. The object will be made of wood or iron or clay. The veritable passivity of the matter is its abstract availability behind the given order that other men will execute. The passivity is the passivity of the human mediation that will procure the matter. The form corresponds to what the man who commands has thought by himself and what he must express positively when he gives his orders. The form is therefore of the order of the expressible. It is prominently active because it is what is imposed on those who manipulate the matter. It is the very content of the order, that through which he governs. The active characteristic of the form and the passive characteristic of the matter corresponds to the conditions of the transmission of the order, which supposes social hierarchy. It is in the content of the order that the indication of the matter is an indetermination, whereas the form is determination, i.e. expressible and logical. It is also through social conditioning that the soul is opposed to the body. It is not through the body that the individual is a citizen, participates in collective judgments and shared beliefs, and lives on in the memory of his fellow citizens. The soul is distinguished from the body just as the citizen is distinguished from the living human being. The distinction between matter and form, between the soul and the body, reflects a city that contains citizens in opposition to slaves. It should indeed be noted, however, that the two schemas, the technological and the civic, if they coincide with one another in their distinction of two terms, do not assign the same role in the two pairs. The soul is not pure activity, full determination, while the body would be passivity and indetermination. The citizen is individuated as a body, but he is also individuated as a soul. The vicissitudes of the hylomorphic schema originate from the fact that it is neither directly technological nor directly vital. It stems from the technological operation and from the vital reality mediated by the social, i.e., by the already given conditions in interindividual communication of an effective reception with the order of fabrication as a case in point. This communication between two social realities, this operation of reception, which is the condition of the technical operation, obscures in the technical operation what allows the two extremes, form and matter, to enter into interactive communication. Information, the singularity of the here and now of the operation, a pure event in the dimension of the individual about to appear.
Okay, this is very profound and thought-provoking for sure as he takes flight into seeing the social transduction, the social as the middle term, and sort of also pointed to certain historical aspects of that. But I have one problem with his his explication around the body and the soul. I feel that he's very adamant about the citizen as the body, which he sort of ties in at the very end there of that paragraph, because he had me thinking like, well, that's not actually the case now. In fact, we have more prevalence of a kind of biopolitical element to the social, and I'm in a little bit of disagreement there too with the soul, the conclusion about the soul, that the citizen is identified with the soul, because in fact that may have been his hope or his determination at the time, but it seems that in fact there is a conflict there in our present day where I would argue that the citizen is not actually identified so much with the soul, and that there's still some sort of impasse, whether it's hylomorphic or some other simulation, which has caused the citizen not to be identified with the soul as much as the body and the biopolitical.
The dual substance of soul and body also seems to be associated in this passage, interestingly, with a duality between language expression and actions carried out in directed by that action, by those expressions. So the status of language in Simondon is very interesting in relation to techniques and in relation to individuation.
Yeah, sorry, I lost the connection for a little bit, so I missed some of that. But I just caught the end. Yeah, the status of language. I think we discussed this when we were reading the technical objects book. That in that whole philosophical anthropology, he never gives an account of where language is supposed to fit in, and so that's an interesting problem, what status language is supposed to have in his general system. But I see that a couple people have had to go, yeah, I need to get something to eat as well. So